Breaking news today. Putin has promised deliveries of grain to Africa, but the O says a ceasefire is the only way to guarantee this. After last week's Russia-Africa summit in St. Petersburg, Putin said an African peace initiative could be the basis for ending the war if Ukraine ceased its attacks. Putin offered to ship grain to some African countries, but the African Union said that wasn't enough to ensure a reliable food supply. President Putin said he's ready to help us with grain supplies, Azali Assoumani said. It's crucial, but it may not be sufficient. Because there is always something unexpected, we need to reach a ceasefire. The longer it goes on, the less predictable it gets. One of Russia's most hated public figures was detained by Russian authorities. Igor Girkin, alias Strelkov, is a former FSB officer from Russia who is now wanted for terrorism and ultranationalism around the world. In addition to the Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 crash, which resulted in the deaths of 298 people, there is also the separatist movement and the conflict in eastern Ukraine. According to the news, Girkin, Strelkov is facing charges of inciting terrorism. The power that the terrorist once served is now accusing him of terrorism in what seems like a case of comical irony. This case is further evidence of the inconsistency and hypocrisy coming from the Kremlin. Hybrid Warriors, Proxies, Freelancers, and Moscow's Struggle for Ukraine by Anna Aratuyan was published in the latter half of 2022. This delves deeply into the separatist movement in Ukraine, Russia's role in the conflict in the Donbass, and the personalities of the Russians who have carried out the Kremlin's orders in that country. The work of Aratuyan, Girkin, Strelkov in the Donbass War is probably the most comprehensive attempt to investigate and define that role. Aratuyan shows his triumphs and blunders without apology but with a level head. He caused trouble and bloodshed for the Kremlin, but he also made Moscow take action it had not planned on taking. Aratuyan argues, among other things, that the Kremlin appeared to be backing the separatist movement because of the appearance of grassroots structures early on. The Kremlin was already dealing with international fallout from its own illegal annexation of Crimea when Girkin, Strelkov led an armed insurrection into Sloviansk and later formed the internationally condemned Donetsk People's Republic, DNR. However, it did not take long for the Kremlin to realize that Girkin, Strelkov's efforts would pay off in the end. The government approved of what has been 8 years of bloody hybrid warfare aimed at destabilizing Ukraine. But in the end, Girkin, Strelkov's antics were too extreme even for the Kremlin to tolerate. Aratuyan claims that Girkin, Strelkov have been a problem for Moscow from the start. He single-handedly plunged an unprepared Kremlin into an international crisis when he was responsible for shooting down Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. Nonetheless, he was able to successfully ferment discontent in eastern Ukraine, paving the political way for Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022. Following the same pattern of hybrid warfare and online propaganda as the previous year's escalation, it was convenient and palatable for the Russian domestic audience. Because of this, he became a useful asset to the Kremlin. His hyper-nationalist stories helped spread an idea that the Kremlin had been pushing for years. Still, Girkin, Strelkov went off the rails even at that point. According to Aratuyan, Strelkov, having returned from Donbass in 2014 and since then launched a campaign criticizing the Kremlin and Putin personally, had more to fear from his own government than he did from the West. Despite the fact that he is wanted in The Hague in connection with the downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, he has managed to avoid capture. Girkin, Strelkov has become more critical of Putin, the Kremlin, and the Ministry of Defense since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, in which he played a significant role. Girkin, Strelkov have repeatedly criticized the Russian government for its disastrous performance in the war in Ukraine. Through his online Club of Angry Patriots media channels, he has been vocal in his criticism of the Russian military and government for what he sees as their inaction in the face of threats to Russian civilization. Even more outrageously, Girkin, Strelkov's club, has declared that it plans to enter politics in order to save Russia from the status quo under Putin. The arrest of Girkin, Strelkov is evidence that the Kremlin's patience with any form of dissent is wearing thin, even though some level of pro-invasion critique, as opposed to anti-invasion critique, which the authorities have punished harshly, has been tolerated. Ultimately, Gherkin-Strelkov is a major factor that endangered the peace in Ukraine before 2014. Anna Aratuyan makes a good point about how, despite causing several international crises, he was tolerated by the Kremlin because the Russian authorities saw the many benefits he brought them. But now that he has been threatening Russia's fragile harmony, Putin and the Kremlin are taking no chances. This is especially true in light of the unprecedented instability, mutiny, drone attacks on the Kremlin, etc. It is deeply ironic, though logical, that the state is now prosecuting its most notorious terrorist for inciting terrorism, given that the state is widely recognized as a state sponsor of terrorism.